Hello, I'm Nigel Ward. I'll be talking about interaction style variation. In short, the question is, do people tend to be consistent in their interaction styles? And the answer is, not so much. So by interaction styles, I think many of us share the intuition that each individual has their own style. You meet somebody and you get to figure out how they like to talk and interact, and you adjust to that. Trying to model that, I think there's two main approaches to that. The first one is the descriptive approach. So Deborah Tannen, for example, has a wonderful series of articles and books. She identifies things like high consideration style versus high contact styles. High contact style, you think of New Yorkers, always interrupting, talking over each other, throwing in their own personal information, versus New Yorkers who more calmly listen, wait until the other person is done, has paused, think about it, and reply with something on the same topic. Two different styles. Now, if our dialogue systems are built by Californians or if they're built by men, that makes us wonder if they're going to work very well for other style populations, let alone the person-to-person variation. On the research side, most work related to this topic, I think, has focused on cross-speaker adaptation. So two people in a dialogue, over time, do they tend to match in, say, pitch height or in speaking rate? There's a lot of work, hasn't been applied too much. 2 years ago, however, Metcalf at Apple wrote a very interesting interspeech paper presenting two versions of Siri. One which was the standard non-adaptive version, one which could detect whether the user was a talkative user or a non-talkative user, and based on that, either answer the question succinctly or at length. And the ones where there was style matching, the users like the system better. Okay, so that's what we'd like to contribute to. The research question is, do individuals have stable interaction styles? Now, this is sort of being presupposed more than investigated, I would say. Most previous work on this topic has found in this corpus, for this set of speakers, there's adaptation on speaking rate, but not on pitch or, so in other words, I don't think any clear picture has emerged. But overall, there is evidence that various kinds of accommodation are going on. It's not clear how strong they are or how consistent they are. So this work is a bigger attempt to look at the question, more data. So rather than controlled experimental data, we're using Switchboard, which contains conversations of people complaining about politicians or talking about pets or describing their experiences with schools, discussing vacation sites. So there's a lot of variety, hundreds of speakers, rather than the typical 3 or 4 features of overlap or pitch height or pitch range. 84 features, and those features are designed to represent meaningful behaviors. Okay, so the big picture of what we're doing is we're creating a space of interaction styles where each fragment, here we use 30-second fragments, is a point, a dot. So here you see 3,000 dots. Each one is 30 seconds out of a conversation, and they're well scattered. Now, we can look at the dots for one speaker. So if the conversations where one speaker is involved tend to be clustered in one region of the space, we can say that speaker does have a typical, fairly consistent interaction style. If they're scattered over the whole space, then we don't find that. The way we measure that is we compute the average for that speaker. So the black dot would be the average of overall conversations for that speaker, minus the one we're trying to predict. And the yellow dot would be the global average across all the speakers, all the conversations, and all the switchboard. So if speakers are consistent, the red dots will be close to the black dot. Those distances will be less compared to the distances to the yellow dot. All right. So to say that in words, we suspected that the style of some unseen clip could be predicted better by considering the speaker's mean, average interaction style across other conversations they're in, lower relative to predictions using just the global mean. And yes, that was true for 2/3 of our subjects, but it didn't explain a lot. Okay, before I give you the numbers there, let me describe the space of interaction styles a little bit better. So thanks to applying PCA, we came up with a space with 84 dimensions. Of those, the top 8 explain 53% of the variance. And several of these will be very familiar from those who know previous research on interaction styles and document styles. Some are a little bit novel. Okay, so we're capturing a lot of what's going on in style variation, but, and here's the sad thing, it doesn't give us a lot of predictive value to know the individual identity. So if you just look at the two numbers on the right, the 44.2 and the 41.4. So those are the distances from a fragment on average to the global style average versus to the speaker's average style. Right. So they are lower for the speaker style. So knowing the speaker style is informative, but it's not very informative. The distance is overall decreased by only 3.6%. That's not explaining too much. So this came as a surprise to me. I really thought that this method would reveal consistent interaction styles. Maybe there's something weird about Switchboard or our features, but overall, I think the consistency of individual interaction styles for non-controlled conversations is completely swamped by the variation due to other factors, which might include topic, time made to utterance, maybe time of day, speaker's mood, all sorts of other factors. All right, so there's the basic message. I have a few minutes left, so I'll use that to describe some additional findings, relate the work better to previous research, talk about the prospects, and maybe some more about the methods. All right, so overall, speakers are not too consistent. However, they were for some dimensions, in particular the positive assessment, negative feelings dimension. Now, this is kind of about a stance, really, or an attitude, but in these dialogues, people tend to get sort of on the same wavelength when they're talking about, a politician or a basketball team or a proposed new law. And they either take a positive stance or a negative stance. In the positive assessment, they of course use the positive assessment construction and a few other things. In the negative feelings, they use the contrast construction. The turn taking is very different. So they tend to have more overlap, usually when they're agreeing strongly about how inappropriate something is. And there's also sort of like significant pauses used to sort of indicate, again, how really deplorable somebody's action is. Okay, so on this interaction style dimension, there was relatively more consistency, but for most, there were not. Dimension 6 was also really consistent. What about men and women? So Tannen has this wonderful series of books on men and women interaction styles. In this data, knowing whether the speaker was a man or a woman gives very little leverage for predicting the interaction style. Even though the effect sizes are very small, there are still differences. So we can see, for example, that on dimension 1, the females tend to be lower, which, because I have the dimensions flipped backwards here, that means in conversations with a female participant, there tended to be more engagement. And some other slight tendencies, which might just shows really that this method is useful, perhaps for studying demographic differences, sociophonetics perhaps. Okay, let's look again at previous research. So I mentioned Tannen, I mentioned the Hirschberg tradition. There's a third tradition, which is the mapping between those macro level style dimensions that we can hear and perceive, and the micro level ones that we can measure. And the three main authors in this field are Bieber, Grothendieck, and Laskowski. They found similar dimensions to the ones I've been describing here. So Bieber, for example, found an information-focused dimension versus an interactive dimension, and he tied that down to specific properties and frequencies of the documents he was looking at. So methodologically, I'm not being super original here. I'm finding similar things, just more of them because we have more data and more features. All right, prospects. What is this good for? Well, I'm not sure it's good for anything yet. This needs to be extended across other genres. So beyond Switchboard, task-oriented dialogues, do we see the same dimensions of interaction style variation? Are there new dimensions to discover? What are important in each genre or dialogue type? Lots of questions to answer. But I think this could be used for adaptive dialogue systems. Once we figure out what determines the interaction style. Then we can change the lexical frequencies, the turn-taking behavior, or the prosodic preferences of the system to hit the desired interaction style and give a better user experience. I'll skip the third bullet point for now. All right, so 2 minutes on the approach. So these are the methods for deriving the interaction style space. So we have a corpus. Each corpus consists of 2 speakers. We have the signal, the waveform for the left and the right speaker. From those, we can plot various prosodic dimensions. I'll skip the details on that, but that will tell us, for example, moment by moment, who mostly has the turn and how strongly they have the turn. All right, then we can quantify that. We can bin that. So here's 7 bins, and the 7 bins measure the frequency or the percent of time that is spent in each region. So this tells us that the right speaker here mostly has the turn, occasionally has it fairly strongly, never has it super strongly. Okay, so those 7 numbers are a characterization of this 30-second dialog fragment. We do the same thing for other dimensions. So here's the minor third construction, an indication of who's leading who and how strongly in the conversation. And for this fragment, again, we bin the frequencies. That gives us 7 numbers. All right, so this is a way to take 30,000 dialog fragments, compute for each 84 features. So there's 12 dimensions, 7 bins per dimension. It's put into PCA. That gives us the principal components. And that defines our interaction style space. Given an unseating conversation fragment, we can use that model to come up with a dimensional representation. And we can use the full 84 features. For everything I've discussed so far, we just take the top 8 dimensions. If we use all 84 dimensions, the results don't really change. And we can also analyze and describe the dimensions. That was done for the 8 dimensions. That's where the labels came from. That was based on examining the topics, lexical frequencies, perceptions of the conversations, and so forth. All right. So that's it. My name is Nigel Ward. You can reach me best at nigelward@acm.org. I welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions.